few years ago, after a recent breakup, I found myself moving into a charming little apartment within a beautiful, quiet, and elegant complex. I quickly befriended my neighbors and several other tenants. It truly felt like a nice, friendly community. A few months into my lease, as I was preparing for bed one night, I distinctly heard the sound of running in the hallway. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. There were no children in my building, so I couldn't imagine who would be running at such an hour. But odd things happen, so I didn't question it further. The sound recurred for the next few nights. I didn't bother to get up and look, as it didn't seem particularly important at the time. It's worth noting that my apartment was on the ground floor, with windows facing a lovely courtyard. The main apartment door was inside the building, requiring a key for entry. Initially, getting used to ground-level windows was a bit strange. Anyone could theoretically walk right up to my bedroom window. I wasn't concerned about anyone in this community doing that, but it was something that crossed my mind when I first moved in. This detail, however, was about to become relevant. One night, I awoke to the sound of soft giggling just outside my bedroom window. It was undoubtedly weird, but I assumed some kids were being foolish and hanging out too close to my apartment. I tapped the window glass and made a loud shushing noise. The giggling ceased for a split second. Then, a faint tapping could be heard from the other side of the glass. It unnerved me, but I wasn't about to give some kids the satisfaction of scaring me. Once I composed myself, I grabbed the curtain and dramatically whipped it open. There was nobody there. All I saw was the quiet night courtyard. Even if there had been kids, I had no idea where they could have disappeared to so quickly. I closed the curtain, shrugging it off. I wasn't going to let some kids ruin my sleep. This strange giggling outside my window persisted for several nights. I learned to ignore it. I have young nieces and nephews, and usually, ignoring their silly pranks eventually makes them stop. That was my strategy with these giggling kids. I assumed that if I simply stopped acknowledging them, they would cease trying to bother me. Unless they gave me a serious reason to report them, I wasn't going to bother the apartment manager. I believe it was 2 days later, while I was at work, that I received an email from the complex manager. Her message was brief. She asked if I could stop by the main office after work, stating she had something urgent to show me. I confirmed I would. Throughout the day, I felt a knot of stress in my stomach, worrying my rent payment hadn't cleared or something similar. When I arrived, she instructed me to lock the door. She began speaking in hushed tones, almost a whisper. A security officer then entered and sat beside me. The manager explained that while the security guard was monitoring surveillance footage, he stumbled upon something unusual. She showed me security camera footage from the hallway, where my apartment was located. Around 2 a.m., 2 small hooded figures approached my door. They appeared to be the size of children, perhaps 10 or 12 years old. In the grainy footage, they stood there, seemingly an inch or so from my door. The most unsettling part was that when she fast-forwarded the footage, they remained completely motionless for nearly 10 minutes, standing incredibly close to my apartment door. Finally, before walking away, one of the small figures reached for the doorknob and attempted to open the door. You could clearly see them jostling the door several times, but it remained locked. After 10 minutes in the video, they skipped away, out of the camera's view. At this point, I was truly freaked out. Whoever these kids were, they were specifically targeting me. I told the security officer and the manager about the window incident, but when they reviewed the footage, they found nothing. We still called the police and gave a statement. They said if anything else happened, to call them, but at that point, there wasn't much they could do. The security officer tried to track where the kids had gone after leaving my apartment door, but it was as if they vanished. They couldn't be found on any other camera in the entire complex. The next night, I decided to stay awake. I was determined to catch these kids one way or another. But that night, there was nothing. No giggles, no sounds from the hall. It was about a week later, around 1:30 a.m., when I heard something again coming from the hall. I muted the TV and listened intently. I heard the distinct sound of my doorknob rattling. It was happening. The kids were back. I nervously rushed over and yelled for them to go away. I heard a child laughing, and then another soft child's voice whispered, "Mom, we're home. Just open the door and let us in." I stood silent. Through the peephole, I saw two small figures, their heads bowed. The voice whispered again, "Please let us in. We're home now, please." The final "please" sounded almost desperate. I didn't care. I yelled that their mother didn't live here anymore, and that I was going to call the police. Both kids started to giggle. Then the doorknob began to shake again. One of the children started throwing their body against the door, but it wouldn't budge. I held the door for a minute. I no longer heard laughing, and the doorknob stopped shaking. When I looked one last time, nobody was there. I was still too afraid to open the door, just in case they were lurking out of sight. I called the police, and the officers quickly assumed it was just local kids playing a prank. I didn't argue. It seemed like the most logical explanation. I finished my statement, and that was that. A few days later, I ran into the apartment manager in the parking lot. She pulled me aside and asked if I had experienced anything since the last incident. I told her no, and that I was sure it was just some local kids. She made a strange face and said she wasn't so sure. She told me that the woman who lived in the apartment before me was, well, strange. For privacy reasons. She didn't give me much information, but she was fairly confident that something horrible had happened to that woman's children. She didn't elaborate or provide any details, not even a name, just implied something terrible and left it at that. She said she had already said too much and didn't want to get into trouble for sharing personal information. She advised me to be careful and keep my doors locked. I'll never forget her walking away saying, "This wasn't a prank." To my knowledge, those kids never visited my apartment again while I lived there. I've spent a lot of time trying to piece together exactly what happened, who these kids were, and what the apartment manager meant. Was she implying they were ghosts? I know that sounds insane, and I'm sure it's not the case, but you have to admit it's strange. It's particularly unsettling that the police and security officer couldn't track where these kids went after leaving my apartment door. Something that dawned on me after I had already moved out was an overlooked detail. There should have been no way for the kids to get inside the apartment building without a key. As I said before, no children lived in my specific building. So, how did they get in? Where did they go? As time goes on and I reflect on this story, I become more and more freaked out. It's astonishing to me that I wasn't more scared in the moment. Years later, and living elsewhere, I'm more scared writing this than I was when I experienced it. I still don't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, but I can't explain exactly what it was. Neighborhood kids is the easy solution, but the more I replay the memories, the more impossible that seems. I know how this story sounds, but I think it's worth sharing. Perhaps I really did have an experience with something not of this world. In moments of fear, uncertainty, or danger, reciting Ayatul Kursi acts as a powerful shield. It reminds us that Allah is the ultimate protector over all things. Recite it after every prayer, before sleeping, and when leaving home. No harm can touch you when Allah's protection surrounds you.